books and talking about the context of that book and then what it looks like from different angles. We study the same material from war over and over again and should look at it from a different angle.
So the whole idea of trying to, and again, we've talked about this before, but yes, my biggest takeaway from this whole thing, campaign, whatever, is recognizing that there's a short game in play and long game in play. Mm-hmm. So to be able to see the long game in every little move you do, that takes work. That's a good exercise, we'll say, for the work. Okay.
I like where you're at. You brought us closer to my answer.
Mm-hmm.
Dave Burke. Any additional information?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would add is when I listen to other people talk or read or hear or whatever that is, and it's certainly a habit that I've picked up, haven't always had this habit, certainly not in the beginning of my reading life, is just trying to figure out why people think what they think. Like, why do they see it that way? And not for the sake of finding out what's wrong with them, but by actually wondering if they're seeing something that I'm not seeing. Like, why does this guy see the same problem that I think I'm looking at and see it so differently? And what does he see that I don't see? And a lot of where that thought came in is my time in the military is when I started flying up a Top Gun was the first time we really got invested in our adversary capability. So we always knew what our threats could do, but it's kind of pretty binary, pretty linear. They can do this, they can do that, we can do this, we can do that. This problem, gets solved by when you shoot a missile or where you maneuver, things like that. When I went up to Top Gun, I became the adversary officer, which means my job for about a year was to pretend to be a Russian pilot, basically. Mm-hmm. Build plans, build tactics, do things. And what I was supposed to do was see the world through their eyes. And that actually helped me learn that when I see what they're doing or what other people are thinking or saying is, why are they seeing the same thing differently? Mm-hmm. And that, to me, leads to what are they trying to accomplish?
One more example, which I think is important, though that's the only reason I bring it up, is the ability to separate your feelings from your behavior. Because usually, like, if you're just not doing any mental work or whatever you feel, your behavior is gonna reflect that. Is typically, we'll say, that doesn't take much work. But and the more intense the feeling, the harder work it's gonna be to change your behavior so it's not based on those emotions, feelings, whatever. So when you can separate those two, that's work.
Wait, what are we separating?
How you feel and how you behave.
Okay, got it.
So when you get angry, you don't have to act angry. Like, that's hard. That's work right there. That's mental work.
Yep. So there's one more thing that I would add to these ideas. So we have read, which I definitely like. Then we're going to read. We're going to question. Both you kind of said the same thing. Like, hey, we're going to question. Why is that like that? Maybe it's a little overlay of my thoughts or feelings about that or my experiences around that. And then what I would say intellectual work kind of requires is to actually write down where you're going. And one of the most powerful things about writing things down, and this is another thing I said on EF Online today, writing things down is de facto detaching from it.
Yep.
So if Dave's having a hard time making a decision, and I could tell him, hey, you need to detach, or I can say, hey, make a pros and cons list. He makes a pros and cons. Now it literally comes out of his head onto a piece of paper, and he's looking at it.
Yeah,
it's actual detachment.
The only way I can write a cons list of my own plan is to be detached from that plan. The only way I can come up with what's wrong with it is to detach from it. Yeah, totally.
So if you're out there and you're thinking, okay, I want to do some intellectual work, well, what you should do is read, you should question, and you should write down what you think. Because when you're trying to write down what you think, it detaches you from the problem. Even if you're trying to write down, even if Dave hands me, 20 pages of his concept about how Russians fly, what I should do is go, hey, thanks, Dave. I should read it, and I should actually write down, hey, I think these were the major points that you hit. And now I'm seeing what I'm understanding, and I'm looking at it. And I go, oh, wait, he also said this. Oh, wait, there's a hole over here. Dave didn't see this really super obvious thing that any idiot would have seen. I'm just kidding. But it allows me to look at it from a detached perspective. So even even if you read something, even if somebody explains something to you, to capture those things, even when you take notes, taking notes is part of it. Taking notes is part of learning. In Way the Warrior Kid, you can't just buy flashcards with math problems, with the times tables. You can't just buy flashcards. You need to make them. You need to write them yourself. That's part of it. That's part of the learning process. Continues on here. We return to the OODA loop to develop our understanding of why others approach competition differently and what the implications might be. We accept that OODA is more than a linear process. A person's orientation interacts dynamically with the other three elements of the OODA loop. Below, we examine how a rival's orientation may be different from ours, and then look at how to use this knowledge to build our understanding of rival approaches to competition. So, we're just going deep into Dave Burke world. How much did you guys focus on the OODA loop at Top Gun?
We talked about it. It's embedded in there. It's funny because I teach, I guess you could say it. I teach a version of the OODA loop now, especially at the muster. My connection to the OODA loop is much more aligned with the principles of extreme ownership. We talk about prioritize and execute, observe, orient, decide, is relax, look around, make a call. So I make kind of a narrow connection, and the way I teach it is narrow by design. Right? It's a 25-minute class. I'm not going to spend hours on this thing. And one of the things that I focus on is the action, the A part of the loop. But when the inception of this thing, when Boyd talked about it, and if you read Boyd's description of the loop, he talks about orientation and basically says that's the most important part. That's the most critical step. And underneath that was his recognition of how hard it is to do what you just described, Jocko. How hard it is for me to go, all right, let me get out of my own head, my own eyes, my own vision of this and see it from another person's perspective. How hard it is to detach. And so as we're talking OODA and the orientation piece, he emphasized that so much because I think he understood it's so difficult to detach and go, well, what are you seeing? How are you seeing this differently? Certainly, great power competition, you could go down to an airplane, but that orientation process is really difficult to do. And that was one of the things we talked about all the time is we would teach from one perspective and fly from another. So if as a Top Gun instructor, I would go teach you offensive BFM, and I would fly defensive.
What's BFM?
Sorry, that's dogfighting, 1-against-1, basic fighter maneuvers. So the whole class I would give you before you and I go fly, I'm teaching you how to be behind me, offensive. And then I would fly the flight as the instructor, the opposite side.
You're trying to be behind me.
No. You're behind me. It's designed to be that. So it's you to get that picture, but the instructor has to be able to have the vision looking behind me, but seeing it as if I'm behind you. The ability to have your orientation. So if I'm going to be a qualified Top Gun instructor, I have to teach you how to fly offensive, meaning you're behind me. I have to fly that whole flight defensive, but be able to explain what happened from your perspective, from your point of view. That's what makes it so hard. That's the orientation. Because in that fight, the way it is you're behind me and I'm defensive. But what I'm actually teaching is I'm behind you and offensive, and it's really hard to do that.
So this idea here is important because now we're not just talking about orient myself. It's what's your orientation? What's my rival's orientation? Yes. And that's a radically different ballgame. And it's funny because I always use the term perspective, right?
Totally.
I want to know what my enemy's perspective is, or what my coworker's perspective is. How are they oriented towards this problem? What's their perspective on this? So this is something that I talk about all the time, but I haven't connected that. What we're really doing is we're seeing their OODA loop. What does it look like for them? Orientation's effects on the OODA loop. Orientation influences all other elements of the OODA loop because it controls how people make sense of what they observe and because it shapes their decisions and actions. Orientation consists of all things that affect how a person understands the world, such as language, culture, genetics, education, previous experience, etc. Humans often use mental shortcuts called heuristics, which we talked about on the cognitive bias program on the underground. They developed for orientation. Now, this is another crazy web of connection. And I've been going off on this. When Daryl Cooper and I did one of the Unraveling podcasts, and we talked about what is your story and this whole thing, and you take that what is your story and then you apply it to leadership and you apply it to life. That's exactly what this is. understanding the person's story, understanding the rival story, understanding the enemy story, understanding your competitor's story, and also understanding your coworker's story, understanding your subordinate story, understanding your superior story, understanding your peer story. All those things are playing into how they are oriented in this situation. So I'm going to throw this out there, just a little something for you. If I'm having trouble with Dave as he's my subordinate or he's my peer, you know what's a good little drill? Is to sit down and write out, what is Dave's perspective? Because now I'm going to detach. Now I'm going to take a step back. Now I'm going to have to actually do the intellectual work. Because I can say, oh, what the hell Dave's problem is. That's cool, but that's not intellectual work. That's intellectual doodling. And I'm pointing at Echo Charles when I say that, because Echo Charles has a tendency to doodle sometimes during this podcast. Yep. Intellectual doodling is, oh, I wonder what Dave's problem is. Intellectual work is, you know what? I need to sit down and write down, what is Dave's perspective? Why does he care about this project? Why is he so concerned about the timeline? Why does he say he needs more people when he's never asked for? Those are really good questions. If I answer those questions and do the intellectual work, I will actually make progress and do a better job of understanding what his perspective is and how he's oriented in this situation. For example, back to the book. When people learn to drive a car, they gain experience in making a right turn. At first, they consciously think through each step, such as engaging the turn signal, looking in their mirrors for other traffic, tapping the brake pedal, turning the wheel. In a relatively short time, this experience becomes a mental shortcut so that when a driver recognizes a pattern their brain knows as right turn, they automatically go through the steps of making the right turn with little or no need for conscious thought about it. A similar type of mental shortcut also happens with great frequency, often in more complex or dangerous situations. So we're not thinking, or we're taking shortcuts, mental shortcuts. What do you got, Dave?
I got to be careful, man. We might not get through this one.
Yeah, I'm starting to freak out.
God, but there's so much in here. You said this, I think, on the last podcast, was this. I know this publication is about competing with our global rivals here, but this doesn't have to be about a competitor all the time. A competitor all the time. It can be the people on your team.
100%.
The people that you're trying to help. And I think the way you're describing it is I mean, that's leadership at its core. And I was just thinking of what an advantage that you have if you can understand from their perspective why they're doing what they're doing. And of course, it helps with your competition. If you know why that chess player is moving the pieces the way that he is, that's a huge advantage. But think about how you can help your people. And this is just the idea that this understanding of their perspective, the leadership power that you have to understand that, and the impact you can have to help them make good decisions or help them get to what they want to get or accomplish what they want to accomplish by understanding their perspective. And you use this example all the time. We talk about kids, and that's actually one thing we can do. Is I remember what it's like to be my 12-year-old daughter, and it's easy to dismiss it and be like, get annoyed with them for behaving or acting or reacting to a situation a certain way, unless you go, oh, you know what? I actually remember what that feels like to be in her situation. I know where she's coming from. I know why she sees this thing as such a huge deal. And if I take that perspective, that orientation, it's so much easier for me to guide her to where I want her to be, to help her, not as a competitor, but someone I actually want to help. So just the connection between the orientation, the competition, and the next piece is actually to lead them. That saying, hey, don't forget where you came from. Like when I became an officer in the SEAL teams, sure. Hey, don't forget where you came from, man. That's a real thing. Mm-hmm. That's a real thing. And you don't want to forget where you came from. What is the thing that you don't want to forget? You don't want to forget that perspective. I wrote about leadership strategy and tactics. I remembered being the last guy on a patrol. No idea where we're going. No idea how much further we have to go until we get there. No idea when we're going to get a break. No idea if there's any streams up ahead where we can get water. No, I don't know anything. And I hated it. And when I was in charge, I remembered. I didn't forget where I came from. I didn't forget what it was. I didn't forget the perspective of being an AW in the back of the train.
So it's like the opposite of the curse of knowledge. Remember that cognitive bias, the curse of knowledge, when you kind of forget that you know everything and everyone else doesn't.
Right.
I think it's the opposite of that.
I don't know if it's the opposite of that, but it's a similar thing where I think everybody knows what I know. And in this case, don't forget. I guess it is. I guess it is. You could utilize that cognitive